Hello everyone, this is follow-up lecture number 2 for week 2, and this is the lecture that's going to follow up on the issues around Phyllis Wheatley and Alauda Equiano. The points that I saw in the discussion boards and in your discussion questions that I wanted to address are kind of here in my notes. So let's go over some things. Starting, I emphasized the notion that this was a period that was influenced by neoclassicist literature. So I wanted to just kind of briefly touch on those issues around neoclassicism. Neoclassicism is primarily a European style of writing that was popular during the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. It's a very long literary era. It's broken up into an early, a middle, and a late period. And if you'd like a lot of details about those, there are Cal State East Bay faculty in the English department who focus in those areas. You could talk to Debbie Barrett-Graves, you could talk to Professor Jim Murphy, either one of them give you some very detailed information about what's happening in the neoclassical era in literature written in English. In any case, the neoclassical writing was what influenced Phyllis Wheatley. As I said, I emphasized the notion of iambic pentameter and the heroic couplet as being a particular literary device that Phyllis Wheatley used frequently. And I'm not sure that I defined what iambic pentameter was. I said a heroic couplet is 2 lines of rhymed iambic pentameter. But iambic pentameter, unless you are an English major who's already covered this kind of material in English 2040, you may not know what that means. So an iamb, which is where the term iambic is drawn from, an iamb is a description of a poetic kind of emphasis, a poetic rhythm structure. An iamb is 2 syllables, unstressed, followed by stress. So da-da, da-da, da-da. And pentameter means that there are 5 of those iambs in a line. So iambic pentameter is 5 lines going da-da, 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 da-da. And you can see that kind of a rhythm in Phyllis Wheatley's poetry. So she does heroic couplets throughout. Speaking of Phyllis Wheatley, I wanted to talk in some detail about Phyllis Wheatley because I think that I'm kind of concerned about the kind of positions that I saw you guys taking in the discussion boards. And I think I want to take a moment to kind of defend Phyllis Wheatley. I see a lot of you, I know that her poetry is controversial, particularly that line, 'twas mercy brought me from my pagan land. And I think a lot of people were somewhat shocked, and some described her interest in Christianity as being something that was, that was vile or atrocious. And I want to defend Phyllis Wheatley because I think that in order to really understand what she's trying to do in her era, you have to pay a good amount of attention to what the times were that she's writing and who her primary audience was. Now here we see a distinction between what Phyllis Wheatley is doing and what's happening in the African American folk culture that we talked about the week before. African American folk culture is writing stories for black audiences, or creating stories, or oral. So they're creating stories for black audiences. And you can speak to people who are of your own group in very specific ways. You have a lot of latitude to say things that might be shocking or challenging that your audience, because you are a member of their group, are going to accept. In Phyllis Wheatley's case, this wasn't the structure that she existed in. Phyllis Wheatley was trying to write for the first time. No one had done this kind of writing before her. There were no models that she could look to. There were no other African American authors that she could look to for inspiration. Like I said, there was one other African American author, Jupiter Hammond, who had wrote just briefly before her, but Phyllis Wheatley didn't have a lot of sort of role models that she could look to. And in fact, the people that she could look to for inspiration were largely people who had significant doubts about her own humanity. And they had a style of literature in neoclassicism that depended upon a sense of order, a sense of kind of a surrender to convention. So for Wheatley to argue that she is someone who should be taken seriously, when as a woman and as a slave, she's someone who is outside of the main group, well, that's pretty difficult for her to be taken seriously. And if she were to come to this audience which sees her already as something less than human, which is why they required of her that she take this exam and prove her worth and value, because they see her this way, for her to come and speak to them in a way that was challenging, for her to come and to speak plainly about the awfulness of slavery, to say that you who hold me as slave, you people are immoral and wrong, and God will get you in the end. For her to make a claim like that, her audience would simply dismiss her as not being able to write poetry, and therefore the cause of black people being able to write would have been postponed. No one would have verified that she was able to write poetry. They would have seen her as simply being, some subhuman who had managed to pen a verse or two, but was not really a poet, was not really an artist. Phillis Wheatley spoke to the concerns of her time and did so in a way that did challenge the structures that kept her in the place that she was. So that even in a poem like On Being Brought from Africa to America, even though she says it was mercy that brought her to America, she still does so by emphasizing that she has become a Christian, and therefore if her readers hold their Christian values to be true, then they can't hold her and other Africans as slaves. Even though it couches this in the language of Christianity and calls it mercy, it does so as part of an argument against slavery. And if you consider who her audience is, that argument comes right to the forefront. So I think that's a very important thing to consider when trying to evaluate Phillis Wheatley. Even though in the present day we've gone through hundreds of years of different kinds of writing from African Americans, in the present day, someone using language like Wheatley's to describe their conditions really would not be acceptable. And understandably, modern audiences would respond negatively to someone in a contemporary voice describing such things as mercy. In Wheatley's time and era, she really had very little other choice if she wished to be considered seriously as a poet. She had to speak to her audience where her audience was. So I think that's just an important thing to consider. And like I said, this is something of a defense of Wheatley. I want to suggest that her poetry is much more intricate than I think some of you gave her credit for in your discussion board post. And I just want to keep that in the foreground. Other thing I want to talk about is Wheatley and some of you got into a discussion of Christianity as for African Americans. And yes, Christianity is a tool of the master class. And as many African American scholars have written, Christianity has in many instances been used as a tool of complacency, as a tool to keep African Americans from looking for justice in this world, and instead putting off those searches for justice in a world to follow. Even though that is the case in some instances, I would argue that Phillis Wheatley, in her conversion to Christianity, was quite sincere. She does see her role as a Christian as being an important one and one forefront, and we should consider that her audience saw it as so as well. So by being such a vocal convert to Christianity, Wheatley is again aligning herself with the values of her audience so that then she can persuade them to take her seriously and to take her arguments that slavery is wrong seriously as well. In addition, I think this opens up a question about the role that Christianity has played in African American culture since the founding of the United States. Christianity has been a tremendous force in improving the lives of African Americans. And I would argue that even though that Christianity towards people of African descent comes from the oppressor class, it is still something that African Americans have taken and transformed and applied to their own needs. So one simply can't discount Christianity as a force in the African American culture. One instead has to look at the intricacies of how that Christianity has played out, how it has been utilized, which aspects of Christianity have been kept, which aspects of Christianity have African American culture discarded with. It's something that is totally transformed and different as these oppressed communities have taken over Christianity and used it to their own ends. So with that said about Wheatley, I want to talk briefly about Equiano as well, who a lot of people read. I asked the question about Equiano's his history, which states that he comes from Africa, and there has been some historical research, which I pointed to, which says that perhaps that origin is not true. It's not 100% certain either way whether Equiano was actually from Africa or if he made that story up in order to give some different kind of credibility to his narrative. I think most of you guys were very forgiving of Equiano about whether it was true or not, and I think that's fine. I don't think that the issue is really about the veracity of Equiano's claims about his African ancestry. I think for contemporary readers, one should know that there is this doubt about this issue. I think that were I not to draw your attention to the fact that there is this kind of debate about his ancestry, it would be sort of disingenuous on my part. I think as good literary scholars, we should be aware of those things which are fact and those things which are more ambiguous. and Equiano's origins are definitely ambiguous. Nevertheless, I think that it does not discount the value of his story, and I think that even other scholars have argued that even if he didn't experience these descriptions of things that happened in Africa himself, they are valid descriptions of things that happen. So I think that's just an important point to look at for Equiano. Also, I think Equiano, I didn't mention, but his work is worth comparing to some other works of neoclassicist literature. In particular, Robinson Crusoe, which is one of the very first novels written in English and is part of this neoclassical era. Robinson Crusoe is a story of a man who is shipwrecked on an island, and it's written kind of a diary kind of a style as he describes what happens to him on this island. And it was written about 50 years or so before Equiano wrote his narrative. So Equiano is no doubt influenced by these early novels, influenced by Daniel Defoe and Robinson Crusoe, which are these neoclassicist works. So I think that's an interesting comparison to make. Equiano's seafaring narrative also goes about building himself up, and it constructs him going from African to slave, and finally to free man. But the free man that Equiano creates isn't just simply a free man who's able to do anything he wants. Instead, Equiano puts a lot of effort into building himself up as something of a businessman. He's a trader, a sailor, and a trader who ultimately becomes not American but British. So it's kind of an interesting kind of play for Equiano. He ultimately lives out his life in Great Britain, in London. So he builds himself up, like I said, as not just free, but free to trade. And that trading, which is important during this period when there is so much economics, so much trade. There's triangular trade, there's ships going back and forth, and it's a new way of establishing economic power and colonial power. This period is through economics. Equiano, in his narrative, builds himself up as a part of that kind of global structure of economics, and he does so through his narrative. And I didn't have you read the whole autobiography, but that's kind of what he does towards the end. So that's pretty much most points I wanted to get at about Equiano and Wheatley. I thought as I looked at your discussion questions, I thought the titles you guys provided for the articles I asked you guys to go and look up about Equiano and Wheatley seemed very interesting. I hope that some of you guys will take the next step and look at those articles in their entirety and read them through. What I'm having you do here by doing this is sort of the sort of first step, sort of a reading review in literary research. So in this research that you guys are doing, you're not looking at primary text. So I'm not sending you to some archive to find the actual first document of Olaudah Equiano written in manuscript to see kind of what his original thoughts were and what marginalia he included. You're not largely going to be able to do that kind of research as undergraduate students. However, you are doing reading reviews. You can do reading reviews. And by looking up these articles, finding different contemporary scholars and what they're saying about these works, you can get a chance to take part in these contemporary discussions. So if you're interested in the debate over Equiano's African history, you can see what contemporary scholars are saying about it, and you can take part in that conversation with some information behind you to support yourself. If you're interested in how people are responding to Phyllis Wheatley these days, the articles that I'm having you guys look up are giving the opportunity to engage in that conversation as well. So I think those kind of activities, that sort of first stage of reading review research, is important for you as in a course on literary history, literary scholarship, which is what we're doing. And you will be doing more of that work as we go forward in the class. So those, I think, are my primary points to respond to your posts about the lecture for week number 2. And thank you very much.